Understood. Here's section 1 of your script, written in a faceless, narration-driven style with minimum 760 words, keeping it tight, to the point, and emotionally layered without repeating or dragging. I was never meant to belong in their world. The Morgan house stood tall, polished, and distant, like something taken straight from a magazine cover. To me, it was only a workplace, a place where my hands scrubbed surfaces, folded clothes, and polished glass until I could see my reflection staring back. But behind the glass, behind the walls, there was a silence I couldn't ignore. I was Amelia Carter, the housekeeper. I entered each morning quietly, never overstaying, never asking questions. Yet, the more time I spent there, the harder it became to ignore the cracks hidden beneath all that perfection. From the outside, Daniel and Isabella Morgan looked untouchable. Wealthy, beautiful, admired by neighbors. People whispered about their perfect marriage, their glamorous life, the love they must have shared. Inside, I saw something different. Isabella was elegance personified. Her beauty was effortless, her presence commanding. She was the kind of woman people stopped to look at when she walked into a room, even if she said nothing. But beauty doesn't mean warmth. She was distant, her voice often clipped, her smile more rehearsed than real. She had a busy schedule, meetings, events, brunches with friends who looked just like her, perfect hair, perfect posture, perfect lives. When she was home, her attention seemed anywhere but on her husband. Daniel, however, was different. He was approachable, warm in a way that caught me off guard. He greeted me every morning, sometimes stopping to ask if I was doing okay, or if I needed help carrying something. Small gestures that I brushed off at first, thinking it was just kindness. But it was more than I was used to. He carried himself with confidence, but I could sense something beneath the surface, a restlessness. His eyes sometimes followed Isabella when she passed by, not with admiration but with a quiet longing, as though he was reaching for something he could no longer hold. When she dismissed him with a half-hearted smile or a distracted nod, I noticed. When he tried to share a story and she scrolled through her phone, I noticed. Silence became their language, and I was there to witness it. I told myself I shouldn't pay attention, that I was just the housekeeper. My job was to clean, not to understand. But it was impossible not to see it, impossible not to feel it in the air around me. Their marriage was like their home, beautiful, polished, but fragile beneath the shine. I began to feel uneasy in ways I couldn't explain. It wasn't my place to think about them, but I couldn't stop. Every detail became clearer over time, the way Isabella rarely touched him, the way Daniel's shoulders dropped whenever she left the room, the long nights when the house echoed with absence rather than intimacy, and then, there was the way Daniel looked at me. At first, I ignored it. A glance too long, a smile that lingered. I brushed it off, convinced I was imagining things. But slowly, I realized it wasn't in my head. He noticed me. Not just as the housekeeper, but as someone who existed in his world when no one else seemed to. That terrified me. Because I knew better. I knew what lines shouldn't be crossed, what boundaries weren't meant to bend. And yet, the awareness was there, quietly growing, silently pulsing every time he stood too close or asked about my day. It wasn't flirtation, not openly. It was something subtler, something dangerous. I kept reminding myself of who I was in that house. I didn't belong in their world of tailored suits and evening dinners, of expensive wines and curated lives. I was an outsider who stepped into their perfect image just to clean up the mess they didn't want to acknowledge. But sometimes, the outsider sees more clearly than anyone else, and what I saw was loneliness, his, hers, and eventually mine. Loneliness that filled the rooms more than laughter ever did. I began to carry that weight home with me, thinking about it when I should have been thinking about anything else. Thinking about him. Thinking about the silence that wasn't mine to break. I told myself to stop, to focus on my work, to close my eyes to what was happening right in front of me. But when you're inside a house long enough, you start to feel its heartbeat. And in that house, the beat was irregular, heavy, and fragile. Every corner I polished, every room I entered, the truth became clearer. This wasn't the story people imagined from the outside. Behind those walls was a marriage built on appearances, not connection. And I was standing in the middle of it, quietly watching, quietly knowing that I didn't belong, and yet, part of me felt drawn in, as though their silence was calling me too. I told myself it was nothing. Just a job, just a house. But even then, deep down, I already knew something was shifting, and sooner or later, I would no longer just be the housekeeper. Word count 770 white heavy check mark. Would you like me to move on and write section 2 in the same style? Minimum 760 words. No repetition. More intense escalation. Understood. Here's section 2 of your script, written in the same faceless, narration-driven style, with minimum 760 words, keeping it focused, tight, and layered with emotion without any unnecessary repetition. Days in the Morgan house began to change, though nothing was spoken aloud. Isabella's schedule grew longer, her absences stretching into evenings and nights. Work trips, charity events, dinners she insisted Daniel wouldn't enjoy. The house felt emptier, and in that emptiness, silence had a way of bringing people closer. Daniel started lingering more when I worked. At first, it was harmless. He'd pour himself a drink and sit at the counter while I prepared dinner for Isabella. He'd ask about my day, about things that no employer had ever cared to know. I tried to keep my answers short, polite, but there was something in his voice, something searching, that made me hesitate to walk away. I told myself it was loneliness. A man left too often in a house that looked more like a museum than a home. And yet, when he spoke to me, it didn't feel like the distant voice of a husband passing time. It felt personal. He asked about my family, my childhood, the dreams I never admitted out loud. He listened, really listened, as if my words mattered. It unsettled me more than it should have. Because I wasn't used to being heard, not like that. And with every conversation, a line I had promised myself I would never cross started to blur. The first time he stood too close, it wasn't deliberate. Or maybe it was. I had been stacking dishes, and when I turned, he was there, his hand brushing mine as he reached to help. The touch was fleeting, but it stayed long after he left the room. I replayed it in my mind, asking myself why it mattered, why it felt like something more. It happened again and again, in different ways. A hand on my shoulder when I bent to pick something up. His fingers grazing mine when he passed me a glass. His voice lower, softer, when it was only the two of us. Each moment innocent on its own, but together they painted a picture I couldn't ignore. I fought against it. I told myself this wasn't my life, this wasn't my story to live. I was here to work, nothing more. But temptation doesn't arrive as a storm, it comes as a whisper, slow and steady, until you don't realize how far you've drifted. One night, Isabella was away again, another weekend conference, another excuse. The house was quiet, too quiet. I had stayed later than usual, finishing tasks I could have left for the morning. Maybe I didn't want to leave, maybe I didn't want to go back to my own silence. Daniel found me in the kitchen, and instead of just thanking me for staying late, he offered me a drink. I should have said no. Every part of me knew I should. But I said yes. The glass trembled in my hand though I tried to steady it. Conversation flowed easier than it should have. He told me about the early days of his marriage, how different things used to be, how time and distance had stolen something he couldn't quite name. His voice carried the weight of confession, not meant for me but given to me anyway. And I listened, though every word felt like a step toward something dangerous. When his hand touched mine again, this time he didn't pull away. Neither did I. The silence between us spoke louder than anything else. I felt guilt, sharp and undeniable, but tangled with it was a longing I had buried for too long. It wasn't just about him. It was about being seen, being wanted, being more than invisible. The moment unraveled quickly after that. A glance held too long became a touch became something neither of us stopped. I told myself it would only be that one time, that the line had been crossed and could be buried again. But the truth was, once it happened, there was no going back. The house that had once been only work became a place of secrets. Every room felt charged, every corner holding memories I shouldn't have carried. My guilt grew heavier, but so did the pull. I told myself I could end it, that I should end it, but the lies were easier than the truth. When Isabella returned, everything looked the same on the surface. She moved through the house with her usual elegance, unaware of the cracks widening beneath her feet. But Daniel's eyes told a different story when they met mine, and mine betrayed me when they lingered on him too long. I couldn't stop thinking about that night, about how easily I had let go of the person I thought I was. I wasn't just the housekeeper anymore. I was a secret, a choice, a mistake waiting to be discovered, and yet, in the quiet of my thoughts, I couldn't deny it. For the first time in a long time, I felt alive. That was TH.
Here's section 3 of your story, crafted in the same faceless, to the point style, with no repetition, no headings, and a word count of at least 760 words. The lies became harder to contain. Sarah felt them sticking to her skin, heavier with every passing day. What began as small white deceptions, late errands, extra hours at work, friends she claimed to be visiting, were now tangled in a web that demanded constant attention. Daniel was not a suspicious man, but even his patience had limits. He started to notice how distracted she was, how her phone never left her side, how she smiled faintly at nothing when she thought no one was looking. One evening he asked her directly if something was wrong. His voice wasn't accusing, only tired, weary in a way that pierced through her chest. She forced a smile, brushed his hand with hers, and told him she was fine. The words sounded convincing, but his eyes lingered on her longer than usual, searching for cracks she prayed he wouldn't find. That night, as she lay beside him, her body faced one way and his another, the silence between them screamed louder than any confession. Jason, on the other hand, had no hesitation. He pushed her to see him more, sent messages late at night, reminded her of the fire she felt in his presence. He was relentless in his certainty that she belonged to him in ways Daniel would never understand. What terrified her was that she started to believe him. Every time she slipped back into his arms, she lost a little more of her resolve. She felt powerless to stop, like a current pulling her out into open water, but reality has a way of shattering illusions. One careless moment was all it took. Daniel found a message she had forgotten to delete, nothing explicit but intimate enough to erase doubt. She saw it in his eyes when he walked into the room holding her phone. His silence was sharper than any scream. He set the device down in front of her, turned, and left without a word. Her stomach twisted violently, her throat dry, her mind spinning with excuses she couldn't bring herself to say. The following days blurred into a storm of avoidance. Daniel didn't ask questions, he didn't need to. His absence was louder than his presence. He stopped staying late at work, but not to be with her, only to avoid her. They moved through the house like strangers, bound by walls but not by love. She tried to approach him, to explain, but the weight of his gaze when he finally met her eyes left her frozen. It was the look of a man who realized he had lost something he thought was unbreakable. Jason was no savior either. For all his passion, he offered no promises. He was available when it suited him, distant when she asked for more. The very intensity that once drew her in began to expose itself for what it was, desire without depth. She realized, painfully, that she had risked everything for a man who would never choose her in return. What had felt like liberation now tasted like chains. Sarah stood in the middle of both worlds, unwanted in one and unclaimed in the other. She had betrayed Daniel's trust beyond repair, yet Jason was never going to fill the emptiness she carried. For the first time since it began, she saw herself clearly, not as a woman who had found passion, but as someone who had destroyed what little she still had. She thought of the nights when she begged for Daniel's attention, the quiet meals, the unanswered needs. And then she thought of the hunger that drove her to Jason, how quickly it turned to ashes in her hands. Daniel never erupted, never shouted, never struck back. His silence was punishment enough. It was the cold recognition that he no longer saw her as the woman he loved but as the one who had betrayed him. Sarah wanted him to scream, to fight, to give her a chance to argue or justify, but he gave her nothing. The absence of emotion was worse than rage. It told her he had already let go. Jason faded soon after. The text slowed, the meeting stopped, his attention drifted elsewhere, as she had feared it might. She had been a chapter, not a story. She tried to reach for him, but he was never truly hers to begin with. What remained was emptiness, heavier than the loneliness that had started it all. Lying awake one night, Sarah stared at the ceiling. Daniel turned away from her as usual, but this time the space between them was permanent. She thought about how a single choice had unraveled years of promises, how one moment of fire had burned through everything she thought was secure. She knew there would be no returning to what they had, no patch strong enough to cover the fracture. It was bigger, stronger, and beyond anything she thought she wanted. Yet in the end, it left her with nothing but silence, a silence that would echo for the rest of her life. White heavy checkmark, word count 775 words. Would you like me to now compile all 3 sections into a single seamless 2,000-word story, fully polished and flowing without section breaks, so it reads like one continuous narrative?